Hello and welcome back to FranklinCovey's twice weekly podcast on leadership with Scott Miller. FranklinCovey is known as the world's most trusted leadership company, founded in part by one of my personal heroes and leaders for very many years, Stephen Covey. Of course, he wrote the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that went on to change hundreds of millions of people's lives, including my own. And I am privileged to have been associated with this firm for nearly 30 years, and as the host of this podcast for the last 6, where we have had the immense honor of spotlighting and interviewing some of the world's most preeminent thought leaders, entrepreneurs, intrapreneurs, wannapreneurs, people who are leaders in organizations at the organizational level or the team or even individual level. Self-leadership, which is the theme of today's podcast. Welcome back to our program is the multi-bestselling author, coach, and keynote speaker, Heather Younger, who has written a series of books in this theme called The Art of. And today's topic is the art of self-leadership. Heather Younger, welcome back to On Leadership.
Thanks for having me. I just love being with you.
It's a pleasure to have you back. Your second appearance, I believe, on our program. You and I have a couple of things in common. One is a passion about leadership. One is surviving many children, rearing them into both ladies and gentlemen in an otherwise tough world. You have 3 boys, and so do I. You have a bonus, however, you have a daughter added to yours. You and I have a lot of war stories to contribute back and forth on authorship and leadership and speaking. And I love following you on social media because you are one of the most prominent and well-known leadership thought leaders out there in the marketplace, and certainly in the top echelon of female thought leaders focused on organizational leadership. You and I also have in common, we've written a series of books, mine in the mess to success genre, and yours in the art of genre. Maybe it's a good pivot point to have you reintroduce yourself to our worldwide audience today. Talk a little bit about how you got to where you are today, including the books that are in this Art of series.
Interestingly enough, so I quit the practice of law many years ago, went on a funny journey of going into sales and customer experience and employee experience. And I got to a position where there was a merged company that was coming together, and it was 4 or 5 companies, and the culture was going downhill. It was not going well. Leaders were not listening. And also people, to be honest, weren't taking ownership on their own mindset inside that kind of combined culture. And I was getting a little sick of my own self, to be honest. And I decided to kind of take a little bit more of an ownership in the process and brought together an employee engagement council and started to really bring their voices to the forefront and help to change the culture during this merged, crazy, environment. There was a layoff as it related to that big, huge merger. I was one of about 200 people. And in that process, I was kind of stuck in the muck. That's how I like to call it. And I decided that I needed to be the voice for other people who maybe felt a little voiceless, either customers or employees at work. And so I decided to write on LinkedIn, and then I started to write other books on it. And one of the things I discovered in the entire process related to culture and engagement is that leaders really are the drivers for a positive or a negative culture. And how leaders show up and how much they think their choices are their choices to make as far as their behaviors at work really do determine what the culture feels like, what employees feel like, customers feel like, who wants to stay, who wants to go. And so that's how I kind of landed on writing a lot of these books on leadership, mostly focusing on caring leadership. The Art of Sequence was really more focused on the concept that with leadership, while I give a lot of the tactical takeaways, some things that they can do to really hold on in their journey, some like A, B, C, 1, 2, 3 instructive things. In the end, it's up to them to determine the brushstrokes by which they show up as leaders every day. So that then that idea of self-leadership and personal choice really enter into the picture. And that's where we land right now today with the art of self-leadership.
I feel like the doctor is in the house, because I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, including one to start about my own career. So I was privileged to work for the FranklinCovey company for 25 years as a full-time employee, ultimately a member of the executive team, the last 4 of which I've been a contractor outside of the firm. Still in good standing, last time I checked. 25 years is a long time. And recently at a company picnic that I was invited to attend by sort of vicarious invitation, one of my colleagues talked about my final years in the company, and he said, colloquially, Scott, they were known as Scott's angry years. And it kind of hurt, but it was probably true, right? I mean, I was kind of burnt out, not from the company per se, but just, 25 years is a long thing doing anything. And they were probably burnt out from me also. I'm sure they were. But when he said that, Scott's angry years, it was 2 or 3, not 25. I thought there's truth to that. There was probably some burnout, there was some frustration, there was some atrophy. And quite frankly, I wasn't taking ownership of my own mindset. To quote you, everyone should be treating their 25th year as if it was their first year, or leave and go do something else. And I'd become a little bit entitled. I felt a little bit like I deserved a certain level of respect when it's not true. And I want you to riff a little further on this concept of taking responsibility for your own mindset, because it is a crucial aspect of the art of self-leadership. Riff on that and maybe talk about why people don't, how easily it is to forget that we own our own mindset, and how toxic that can become on our teams, our company culture, and how it permeates into clients.
This one resonates so much for me because personally, even inside the book, I tell a lot of stories of when I let my mindset slide, even like for the example I just shared related to that merger and how I got stuck in the muck. My mind started to slip. I started to get into the place where I was acting like the other people around me, and I recognized it, and I had to put like a kibosh on that really quickly. And so I think this idea of owning our mindset is sometimes we can not even sometimes, often we can feel ourselves slip. We feel it. We recognize that we feeling in our bones. We see it in the mirror. We see it in our actions. But sometimes we just want to keep staying there. And I think the trigger, at least for me, is this idea of just getting sick of myself. Say, I'm in this mess. I've been in this mess. Do I want to stay in this mess? And so one of the things that's so funny, I'm just writing a little blog on this, but this idea of leaning into learning. And whenever I get to the point where I feel like I'm sinking in my own head, in my own mind, the thing I say to myself is, what can I learn from this situation? Or how can I put myself in a situation where I can learn? Because one of the things I found, in addition to books and courses and things like that, is that if I can plunge myself into a whole bunch of new learning or new way of thinking, now I can get myself out of that mess. I can get my mindset out of the mess, and it really is that, because a lot of the things that I talk about, in this book, but just generally from stages and everything, is oftentimes we are waiting for green lights. We are waiting for someone to come save us. We are waiting for someone to tell us it's the right time, it's the best thing. In the end, there's really no one else that can do that better than us. So once we start giving away that power, we're going to have a hard time shifting our mindset. But once we say it's time for me to take my power back, now I can say that means I own if I feel stuck. And that means now, again, I know some tools. One of the tools is dive into some new learning. What can you do to think and be differently tomorrow?
Heather, your book releases today. The title is The Art of Self-Leadership. The tagline is Discover the Power Within You and Learn to Lead Yourself. I happen to have a galley copy that's coil bound. My official copy is arriving today, I think, but we're taping today as well. I think my favorite part of the book is a concept where you talk about the power of reframing as a way to bounce back from disappointment, adversity, from crisis. I think it's in chapter 4, which was titled Personal Growth. Let me see here. No, Deciding Between Progress and Perfection. Will you riff a little bit on this idea of reframing? I know it's grounded in some work that you give credit to Carol Dweck and growth mindset. Talk about how do we reframe, and when do we know when it's our responsibility to reframe?
I love it. So this concept of reframing isn't new. It actually is grounded in psychology. And so psychologists use this concept to help their patients through really tough circumstances when again, they feel stuck and they're really struggling. So we automatically reframe. It's just what we all do, kind of human, as a way to save ourselves. But in this case, I want us to be looking at being intentional about reframing. So here's the concept. You have these irrational thoughts. Let's just use that example of when I was in that merger situation. And then the layoff happened. And I was like, oh, am I going to be able to get a job? Am I going to be able to keep my kids in the same school? Am I going to ever, basically I went into this pit of despair. That's what I like to call it. And until I got to the point where I was sick of myself, because no one else was, by the way, coming to save me. No one else was coming to pull me out. I had to think about what could I do to then bring myself up to lead the team that I was going to next, lead my internal team, right? My family. We were a family of 6 at that point. And so I had to say, what can I do? So I decided to what I call flip the switch. So take myself from the irrational thoughts, flip the switch to say, those thoughts no longer serve me, and now go to the rational side of things. So this is where I had to say to myself, how then do I learn to think of what's just happened to me in a different light? Now, it doesn't change the circumstances that I was laid off. It doesn't change that at all. I still was jobless in the moment. But what I did by intentionally making the decision was to say, I want to change how I see from what just happened and what I learned from what just happened. So in that case, I look back and I'm kind of stepping outside myself and I'm looking back at the scenario and I say, you know what? I learned a lot there. Like there was technology I never knew there. Before that, I learned how to do demos. I had my best friends there. I got a severance from there. Oh my gosh. That layoff ended up being the best thing for me. In fact, I'm on this podcast now the second time, right? Writing my fourth book next year, my fifth book, because of that layoff. Holy smokes, that was an amazing opportunity. So that was the intentional reframe that I did. And I use that tool. Many people who have kind of gone up and down or had some maybe adverse situations in life have learned to use that as a tool. And I think if we can all be more intentional, oh my gosh, like what kind of people can we be for ourselves and for others if we do that?
Lisa, like you, I've spent most of my entire career focused on leadership development. Learned a few things, written a few books myself. But this particular concept spoke to me, like jumped off the page in your book, because we all believe the stories we tell ourselves, right? Whether we had a good childhood or a bad childhood, or whether that boss was a jerk or they were just harder on us because they loved us more and thought we could handle it, right? And I run a little bit paranoid. I know that. As a human, I run a little bit paranoid, and therefore I make some things up that aren't always true about other people's intentions, about where I sit in terms of my competence or how I'm respected. And this has really helped me to better lead myself, to reframe, kind of take a breath and say, am I owning my mindset? Is it accurate? Is it whole? Is it complete? Do I have all the facts? Do I have enough of the facts? Have I gone to that person and said, hey, I heard you say, is this true? And so you've actually matured me since I've been reading this galley copy around fully owning the story I'm telling myself and helping me decide when do I need to reframe, even when I do have the facts. So it's a gift you've given to me. I want to move that statement into a question. I think the art of self-leadership has kind of become talked about so frequently, I think it's dismissed, meaning, lead yourself, lead the team, lead others, lead yourself, lead the organization, lead the society. I think it's been talked about a lot that not enough time is actually spent focusing on it. You've written a whole book about the art of self-leadership. Why? Is this your third book?
It's the fourth.
It's the fourth book. Why did you come back to this? Of all the books you could have written about, all the topics on listening and culture, emotional intelligence, you keynote around the world frequently on a broad variety of topics. Why did you choose this to kind of ground your fourth book in?
Good question. Yeah, here's one thing that really came up for me. It's actually in 2019, I did a TEDx talk called Transforming Adversity into Opportunity. So I definitely tell everybody to go watch that because some of that reframing concept really is flourishes or it shows itself in a big way there. But that's where it started for me. And I would see in the world a lot of people blaming other people for their actions, for the things they didn't have. And I thought to myself, okay, listen, when you read this book, you'll see I have plenty of reasons to be a victim. If you look in the encyclopedia, you look in the dictionary, you could very well see my face, but I chose not to put myself in that bucket. And instead, I said, what can I own on this journey? How can I make different choices so that I can never or will never be put in that category? So that started back then. And then over these years now, I've been speaking, and I started really more full-time speaking in 2020. And I would be speaking to audiences, and I would be talking about caring leadership. And self-leadership, by the way, is the biggest and the most important behavior underneath caring leadership. And I would hear things from people in the audience, like if I'd say, well, why can't you be a better listener? What's stopping you from doing these things under caring leadership? And they'd say, well, my manager, or the executive leadership team is this, or my resources are really narrow, or the culture is this or that. And after hearing this year after year, I got sick again, kind of like I got sick of myself in that merger situation. And I said to myself, wait a second, we have got to get a hold of ourselves. Again, no one's coming to save us. No one's responsible for how we show up but us. We may feel a certain way how someone treats us or about our current circumstances, but we can choose what we do about those feelings. We can choose to stay in that victimhood, or we can choose to say, I'm going to take ownership in it. And so that's what it was. I think I got just up to here, sick of it. Again, starting with being sick of myself, and still here and there intermittently being sick of myself, and saying, we have got to own this. So self-leadership for me really is this journey, or this idea of looking inwardly to shine outwardly, to kind of polish the inside to then allow the outside to shine more brilliantly, focusing on things like self-awareness and resilience and personal and continuous growth. And I think that's what it really what boils down to.
Speaking of moving inward to outward, your chapter 8 is all about relationship building in action, a topic that I'm passionate about because I'm both good at it and I struggle with it. I speak about this topic a lot. We're all in the same business. We're in the relationship business. We're all looking consciously or subconsciously to get better at listening, empathy, communication. I think what great leaders have in common is they're experts at building a foundation of trust. You write about that, about listening and showing empathy, but also about being a clear communicator. You dedicate a whole part of your chapter 8, around being a great communicator. You and I share this in common. I think most people would probably argue I'm a decent communicator. I think everybody would argue you are an exceptional communicator, but you confess in the book that you're not always as clear as you think you are, that others think you are. Well, you address some of the challenges that you personally faced. Your self-awareness increased, and you learned to do X, Y, and Z better in your communication. And what are some of the common struggles that others face that you coach and speak to, that their relationships can improve when they're better communicators? What do those ingredients look like?
Scott, I love you. You know, I'm in my early 50s, and so my brain to hold all those questions, I'll do my very best, okay? As it relates to being a more effective communicator and how maybe I struggle with it, I can tell you that, boy, as a manager of teams especially, I can think of times where I could see that maybe my body language or what I was saying to someone might have hit wrong, but I ignored it and it kind of went on my way, and I had to come back and kind of double back with it. I also remember just with my own brand early on asking someone to kind of sniff test where I was going. So I would say, okay, well, I'm going into the employee experience space, but I also like this space. And they'd say, what are you communicating here? Are you employee experience? Are you customer experience? What are you? You need to be one thing or another. You kind of, and to that extent, you kind of have to stay centered so that people know what you stand for. And so that was a kind of a really big wake up call for me. I had a few people doing kind of a brand audit for me to tell me how my communication out in the world and what I was saying I stood for, how it actually was. It confusing? Was it clear? That was a big one from a business perspective. I think often my kids call me on the carpet. You and I talked about this, where they'll say, "Oh, you're the good listener person. You wrote a whole book on it, but I don't think you're listening to me." Like those kinds of things. And one thing I always like to say is that when we think about communication, listening is a portion of it. Most of us think communication is just what we say, but it's also how we receive information, and then it is, of course, what we're perceiving and what people are perceiving of us. So it's the entire thing wrapped up together. How well am I present with another person? How much am I taking in of what they're saying and then giving back to them what it is they need? Being solution oriented. So being that present person is key. And often we struggle with that. We have a hard time, I know, with the cell phone and the Slack messages and all the things that are around us to distract us, just get in our way of being effective communicators. The other thing I think we do, and a lot of us struggle with, is that we try to communicate with people the way we feel most comfortable communicating versus saying, what is this person's communication preference? What is the thing that's going to land on this colleague or this manager better so that I can achieve more in my role?
That is a piercing insight. There's a famous Brit who wrote a book called, I forgot, but the book was called Listen to the Listening. Julian Treasure, very famous TED Talk. And he talks about the same concept as people listen differently than you do. And your voice, your tone, your rate, your pitch, your pacing, your inflection, the words you choose, how you resonate with someone is different than someone else on your team. I'm lowering my voice right now. Some of you are liking me for the first time finally because I'm calming down and I'm talking. But I speak the way I like to listen. This loud, powerful, voice. I'm sure there's something deeply psychological behind that. But you touched on something that requires a level of self-awareness, Heather, that most of us don't have, which is to understand how are you received? How are you perceived? Because how you're delivering something is rarely how someone else is, perceiving it or receiving it. I love that you focused in on that. Let's talk about a final topic. One that I just suck at, my friend, and that is chapter 5, prioritizing self-care. I have neglected this. I have dismissed it. I have come to realize I failed. About a week ago, I said to my wife, we just moved into a new home, and I was in the shower, and I said to her, I'm going to use a word, Stephanie, I've never used in my life. I looked at her, and I got her attention. I said, I'm really suffering, because I have a pretty debilitating case of plantar fasciitis in my feet. And it requires ice cupping and certain shoes and never going barefoot and massaging. And it kind of, rears its head and then it, comes back. And I wear dress shoes a lot because of I'm on stage. And I said, I'm really suffering. And she insisted that right then I drop what I'm doing, drive to the Salt Lake Running Company store, buy some ugly but extraordinarily valuable shoes for inside the house and outside the house. I didn't want to do it. I write like you so much, my thumb has a little bit of either arthritis in it or all the social texting, and so she bought me a little brace. These are small areas, but I don't do a very good job of self-care. I want you to take over this podcast right now and speak to millions about how important self-care is as part of self-leadership.
I was working at a job, and at some point I'm sitting in my office and my face and my eyeballs and the right side of my body goes numb. And I'm in my late 30s and I'm thinking I'm having a stroke. And I go to one of my team members, so my direct reports, and they say, I think I'm having a stroke. Can you take me to the ER? And they take me to the ER, and I get there and they do all the tests, and ends up being I was having an extreme panic attack, my first ever. And I realized in that moment that I had let myself go way downhill. I let the person who was leading me, the manager that was there, really take more power than I should have allowed her to take over kind of my journey and where I wanted to go. I realized I had just let some things in the home environment go downhill, and I wasn't physically taking care of myself. This is an extreme example of how physiologically your body will respond if you do not care for you. The other thing is that we don't realize as leaders is that people are always watching. It's kind of a creepy idea, but it is the truth. Particularly the higher up you go in an organization or in a position or in the world, people are watching you even more. And so they are also watching for permission for how they can show up.
True.
So kind of in the case that you talked about, Scott, now your sons are watching how you care for you, and you are giving them permission or a lack thereof of how they then will show up for themselves, and then allow permission for other people down their line. So for those who are watching and listening, the key here is to understand that you're not just caring for you first, because you are kind of the grounding for all of this. But if you want to have that influence, that ripple effect in the world, that leaving that legacy of care and concern for others around you, you have got to give to you first. Giving from that empty cup and giving leaves it dry. And who in the heck wants to be around a person giving from their dryness? That's the question I'm going to leave you with here.
Self-correction. The book is How to Be Heard from Julian Treasure. What you just said reminds me of one of the wise things Dr. Covey said: be a light, not a judge; be a model, not a critic. As a leader, part of self-leadership is modeling the behaviors you want to see in your team members. And I tell leaders frequently, you must take a vacation. You must go on vacation, because that gives your team members permission to also take their PTO, take their sick leave, take their time, and go on vacation. I don't care if you're an introvert. I don't care if you can't afford it. Go home, lock the doors, and buy a sun machine. And don't post for 5 days. But you need to show your people that you value self-care, that you value taking time off, because they will do what you do. They will do what you give them permission to do, or they will find a leader who will encourage them and not shame them to take a vacation. Heather, rather, in this chapter, you write about the power of celebrating your wins. This is something that I have come to better appreciate since reading your book. Lisa Nichols calls them micro wins. And it's something I've never done. This is an important role for leaders to remember, is to sometimes, don't celebrate you made it to work on time. Don't celebrate you didn't get into a wreck in the car, but celebrating the small things that you do, because sometimes finding big wins is hard in, a Western, dog-eat-dog culture and a quarterly driven organization focused on profits. It is sometimes, or a leader who maybe doesn't know how to share or celebrate wins because she or he wasn't modeled that in life. Reiterate this idea around celebrating your own wins.
Okay, so before I do that, I just want to say two more things. And this kind of relates to the wins concept and the self-care concept. The first is, I love vacations. That would be good to take that. But sometimes it's the small things. For example, like having a water bottle near you and drinking and committing to a certain amount of drinking in those water bottles every day. It's a small self-care practice, very, very small, but it has massive benefits. The other concept is grace, self-grace. Inserting the time right now. I'm saying this, we're having this conversation, and I do not want you to be smacking yourself hearing what we're saying, like, oh, I didn't do that well. Yesterday I was horrible. This morning I was horrible. The whole point that what Scott and I are talking about is this opportunity, this invitation to begin anew, to do something different starting tomorrow or this afternoon. Okay, so now we're moving into this idea of celebrating wins. By the way, I have been gosh awful with celebrating my own wins. And I decided to start going back and go, okay, you may have felt bad about 2024. You may have, it's been like so-so. And then you go back and look and you're like, oh my gosh, the wins that I thought were small were actually bigger than most people's wins.
Amen.
Right? And so I think it's like understanding the slivers of the things that we do, how much they move us forward to the next thing. It's kind of tied to that reframe concept too, right? But it's like, that the slivers are the area, the slivers of improvement, the tiny bits of movements, that micro wins you're talking about, are the things that get us just that much closer. So I think that the looking at the calendar from week to week and going, what happened? Oh, shoot, that day I did that. I didn't really. Journaling would be amazing to do. Taking a journal, and at the end of every night, you hear people talk about gratitude. I think gratitude journals are great, or even just like a win journal, where it's like, what were my wins for today? And writing down the small things that actually, again, for a lot of people who are maybe, for example, going through depressive states, having anxiety, anything that could be happening, the tiny little thing that we have is actually the thing that could get them out of bed, that can help them move forward one more day. So understand that the slivers are the things that drive you to the much bigger wins that you're really looking for.
Heather, I read your book on 2 cross-country flights this week. And I came back and I was talking to my wife this morning over coffee. It's kind of when we repair our marriage. It's around 5 to 5:30 when the boys are still sleeping and not conniving against us. That coffee time is very important. And this morning I was telling my wife, we were going through our days, I was telling her that I had the privilege to interview you again today. And I was talking about your book. And I talked about this idea of celebrating your wins, because I think all of us are in some level of that sort of comparison conundrum, where we're comparing ourselves to people on LinkedIn or Instagram or TikTok or YouTube or X or Facebook, and we only see everybody's best-selling book. We only see their courses crushing it, or they're on their 50th keynote. What you don't see is how many books they wrote that flopped, how many pilots that never got picked up by the studio, how many years they were a waiter on Sunset Boulevard before they got their big break, or decades. And when I'm asked what is the one thing that is consistent amongst the 500 people that I have interviewed on this set, is no one has any idea of all the failures, of all the things that broke, the bankruptcies, the store closures, the books that never sold, the speeches that never took off, the videos that didn't go viral. We only see the best stuff. And you and I have this in common, is I think we have a level of perseverance. We have a level of continuing to, stay within our broad lane, but understand what are we passionate about and to keep going. I'm going to guess this wasn't your natural personality growing up. Maybe it was. End us off with a lesson or two of what you have learned as you continue to sort of celebrate your wins and pivot up the level of influence and build your your business as an author and as a coach and as a course designer and deliverer, as a keynote speaker. What are some of the lessons or setbacks that you've had that others might take some value in, saying, I had no idea.
Mm. Well, I mean, I talked about that layoff. That's one thing. I had, in my background, I lived in a home with drug addiction. And I'm sure that's probably one of the things you're referring to in that. And I'm the only child. And so being in that situation, without going into too much detail, was a really enlightening one. It was an enlightening one because I think even in that moment, I could have chosen to go a different path. I could have chosen to be like kind of a weaker person given that same course. And instead, I just said, I just refused to go down that path, to be that person. There was a lot of kind of racial stuff in my background. My mom is white and Jewish. My dad is Black and Christian. And so having that, there was a lot of yuckiness, where not acceptance, a lack of belonging in that environment. Again, only child going through this, wondering why I wasn't included in those different circles, and saying to myself, I could give a care, because in the end, I'm going to create my own circles. I'm going to make my way through it. I'm going to make my way in it. And so I think it was a lot of mindset. It was a lot of, early on, I think when you say kind of the perseverance thing, I think it was there because of the journey, the adversity. The adversity is the thing that propelled me forward. It's the thing that got me through it. But like you said earlier, oh my gosh, so many failures. The list you listed off, I had all of those things and more. But I think the key was I knew there was always something there. There was always this, I talk about in the book, this idea of the clay that we place over us. We place clay over us because we don't necessarily want people to see our shine. We don't understand the value of our internal shine. And so in order for us to be that brighter light in the world, to have the impact, to have the legacy that maybe we have in our mind, that we set up that this is who we're supposed to be, we have to remove the clay. We have to kind of take off the armor, be a little bit more vulnerable, being more open, and to understand what it is we value, understand what our values are, how people value us, what our worth is. And I had to go on that journey. It's still a constant journey of saying, what is that worthiness, right? That self-worth. I have a lot of confidence, but oftentimes the worth is the thing that boils up to the surface. In the end, though, I know this, no one else is going to solve that for me. It has to be me. I have to put together a plan. I have to execute it every day. And there are going to be days, because of self-grace, where I just do not show up as my best self. There's going to be days I just do not land on every goal I put forward. And that is okay. And guess what I'm going to go do then? I'm going to plunge into learning something else, growing me. And when I do that, now my shine starts to become more brilliant again.
I have more questions, but that was beautiful. I'm going to leave it there because that was some good stuff. Heather Younger, your fourth book, The Art of Self-Leadership, Discover the Power Within You and Learn to Lead Yourself Out Today, from Wiley. Delighted to have you back on the podcast today. Look forward to maybe a return appearance with some of your books that are in the pipeline as well. I love the fact that you already have the next several planned out. Clearly, you are a long-term thinker, or you're just a great visionary. Maybe you're both as well, too. Heather Younger, thanks for your time today. Great to see you.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate you.
And we'll see you back here next week for a new conversation on leadership.